After his conversation with Brian, Tom decided to leave his costume for later, since he didn't want to go through the stress of wearing it now and taking it off later to go get lunch for Lucy, and then wearing it again. He had thought of asking Harry to send someone to deliver lunch to Lucy on his behalf, but he had decided against that since it would not only stir suspicion among the staff, but would also defeat the purpose of the whole thing. It wouldn't make sense if Harry was to ask one of the staff to deliver lunch to Lucy and have them tell her that it was from her driver, who was too busy with another lady to bring her lunch up to her. Tom let out a sigh as he glanced at the large wall clock which was hanging on the wall directly opposite his seat. He still had about 2 hours before lunchtime. Perhaps he could just change now and then take off the costume during lunch break? The costume was more for Lucy's benefit than his, and there would be no need for her to come to his office twice in a day. Once he made up his mind, he stood up from his seat and walked into his mini bedroom where he had kept the costumes. Thankfully, he had practiced enough within the last hour, so dressing wasn't very difficult. When he was done putting on his costume, he dialed Harry's line and asked him to meet him in his office. Less than 5 minutes later, Harry walked into the office and stopped by Lucy's desk. "The CEO is in his office now. I'm going in to have a word with him," Harry said politely before unlocking Tom's office door and walking inside. He shut the door behind him and stared at Tom for some seconds with his head cocked to the side as though he was trying to find faults. "What do you think?" Tom asked impatiently. "I don't think she will recognize you. You look boring," Harry said with a grin, and Tom glared at him. "I think you should wear the glasses too. It will complete the look," Harry added thoughtfully, making Tom pick up the glasses which was on his desk. "Now you're good to go," Harry said with a nod of approval after Tom had put on the glasses. "This is exactly what a weird boss like you should look like," he said with an amused chuckle as he took out his phone to snap a picture. "You seem to be having too much fun, don't you think?" Tom observed with a slightly raised brow. "Yeah, it's not every day you see a full-grown man doing something this crazy," Harry said as he took some snapshots and then returned his phone to his pocket. "Whatever," Harry chuckled. "If that's all, I should return to my office. I have to attend a meeting on behalf of the CEO, who is on leave of his senses," Harry said as he headed for the door. "I suppose you're ready to meet your assistant?" he asked once he got to the door. "Send her in," Tom said, choosing to ignore Harry's taunt. Meanwhile, at the other end of the door, Lucy kept staring at the laptop screen in front of her with a distant look in her eyes. Never had she been more distracted in her life than she was at the moment. Ever since she got into her office that morning, her mind had wandered from Tom to her boss and then back again, taking turns each time. Even though she had made up her mind to friend-zone Tom, it seemed like her brain had a mind of its own and kept replaying everything he had said to her the previous evening. The memories made butterflies flutter in her belly each time the thought crossed her mind, especially the memory of him squatting in front of her and grazing her lower lip with his thumb. On the other hand, her thoughts concerning her boss were completely different. She had initially been asking herself a lot of questions and trying to figure him out. What did he look like? What kind of personality did he have? Was he going to try to make things difficult for her? When would he get to the office? And then, after Harry informed her that the CEO was in the office, her heartbeat had doubled, and now her palms were sweaty as she stared at the screen with unseeing eyes. Between her driver and her boss, she was sure she was going to get a heart attack if she continued this way. She snapped out of her thoughts when she heard the doorknob turn and she saw Harry step out of the office. She quickly stood up when he approached her desk. "It's time for you to catch your first glimpse of the CEO. He wants to see you now," he said, making her stomach churn. Harry looked at her for a brief moment, and he almost smiled when he noticed how tense she seemed. If only she knew how much trouble his mad friend was putting himself through, just for her sake, she wouldn't be so nervous, Harry mused. He looked forward to seeing how this whole madness would end, though. "You should breathe," he suggested, making Lucy realize that she had been holding her breath. She gave him a nod as she took in a deep breath and let it out slowly. Don't worry. He doesn't bite. Unless he is very upset, Harry added with a straight face before walking away, leaving Lucy to wonder whether if that was meant to be a joke or he was serious. She glanced at the door as if a wild animal was positioned behind it, waiting to attack her. Calm down. Just calm down. She whispered to herself a couple of times before heading for the door. She paused to adjust her suit jacket and quickly patted her hair to make sure it was well arranged before knocking on the door very lightly. Even though he had requested for her, she still believed that was the polite thing to do, since she had no idea what he was doing. Hearing the knock, Tom's brow creased in a frown as he glanced at the door. He had expected her to just walk in since he had sent for her. Did she really expect him to respond and invite her in? Even after he had told her that he didn't like talking, but preferred to communicate through texts and emails? He was just going to ignore her. Perhaps if he failed to respond, she would realize he had no intention of speaking. Lucy stood there waiting for him to invite her in, but when she didn't hear anything after some time, she shut her eyes as she reluctantly reached for the doorknob and turned it. Once Lucy walked out of Tom's office, she heaved a deep sigh of relief as she collapsed into her seat. She just realized one thing. Calling the CEO a weirdo didn't cut it at all. That was a very big understatement. As a matter of fact, she now believed that calling him a weirdo seemed like a very big compliment for someone like him. He was worse than a weirdo. Why had he called her into his office if he had no intention of saying a word to her? She had just stood there like a statue, staring down at her feet while trying hard not to raise her head to look at him, just in case he was watching her. She had stood there by the door with her head bowed, for what seemed like forever until he tapped on his desk to get her attention. She had managed to raise her head a little to look at him, hoping he would at least say something to her, but the weirdo had only waved her off, but not without turning away so she wouldn't see his face. Luckily, she had caught a glimpse of the side of his face in time before he turned away from her completely. At least, she now had an idea of what he looked like. The color of his hair, and many beards. The most annoying thing she had discovered was the fact that he wore glasses. To think that he had stopped her from using her glasses, whereas he was also wearing glasses. She had no idea whether the glasses were medicated or not. She didn't care. He had no right to wear glasses after asking her to not wear her medicated glasses. Right now, all she could do was wish every lady who was interested in him good luck. She intended to give Sonia a call later and tell her to get rid of any idea she had in her head about them marrying both brothers. Not that she had any intention of getting married to anyone, but even if she had slightly entertained the thought because of Sonia and her family, she would rather die than have anything to do with a person like her boss. Inside the CEO's office, Tom chuckled as he walked over to the door and locked it with his key before taking off his wig and glasses. She seemed really terrified of him. He had watched her all the while she stood there with her head bowed, and he could swear he had seen her hands tremble for a moment. How was he supposed to seduce her if she was this scared of him? Tom winced when he felt his head throb painfully and raised a hand to his temple before looking at the wig with a frown. He couldn't help but wonder how some ladies coped with wearing wigs when his head ached this way, only after wearing it for only a couple of minutes. He walked into his closet and took off everything, including the suit he had worn over his shirt. Once he was sure everything was in place and he looked like Tom the bad boy again, he returned to attend to some documents on his desk. By the time he was done with the first document in front of him, it was lunchtime. He dropped his pen at once and pushed his seat away from the desk before standing up. A part of him really wanted to share lunch with her, but he knew he needed to do as Brian had suggested if he wanted more from her than just a friendly lunch. Bearing that in mind, he took his private elevator and exited the building before walking around his private car park to the entrance of the building, which everyone else used. Once he entered inside the building, he observed that most of the staff were already heading to the cafeteria, so he joined them. Wow, isn't he hot? One of the ladies whispered to her friend when they sighted Tom walking towards the cafeteria from a different direction. I think I'm going to say hi to him during lunch today, another whispered to her friend excitedly. A beautiful blonde lady who was walking not too far away from the ladies glanced in Tom's direction when she heard them whispering about him, and she raised a perfectly arched brow when she saw the familiar face. Tom? She called out loud in a questioning tone since she wasn't sure he was the one. Tom paused and turned in her direction when he heard the familiar voice, and raised a brow when he saw Anita smiling and waving at him. What was she doing here? He wondered as he remained where he was and waited for her to walk up to him. It is really you? I almost didn't believe it, Anita said excitedly as she joined him and smiled when she noticed the envious glances she was receiving from the other ladies. Why are you here? Tom asked impatiently. Come on! That is no way to talk to me. Why don't we talk over lunch? You look very different, by the way, she said with a pleasant smile that suggested it was a good kind of different. Without waiting for him to say anything, she slid her right arm under his left arm and dragged him along with her towards the cafeteria. Tom, who was wondering what she was doing in his company premises, allowed her to lead the way until they got to a table and she sat down. Excuse me for a moment, he said in a polite tone before walking away from her to where the food was being served. He wasn't going to let Lucy starve simply because he was talking to someone as insignificant as Anita. Once he got Lucy's lunch, he looked around the cafeteria until his eyes fell on the lady he recognized to be Lucy's secretary, and he approached her table with the lunch pack. Hi, could you please help me deliver this to Miss Perry in her office? Let her know I couldn't deliver it myself because I'm having lunch with someone, Tom said, as he jerked his head towards Anita. Although he tried to make it sound like a humble request, it still came out like an order, and Lucy's secretary gave him a quick nod as she took the lunch pack from him and stood up to do as he had asked. Thank you, Tom said before walking away. Once he returned to the table where Anita was seated, he pulled out the seat opposite her and sat down. So what are you doing here? Tom asked again, wondering why she hadn't bothered to go get her meal while he was away. Anita had thought he went to get their meal when he excused himself, but seeing him return empty-handed, she tried not to let her disappointment show. Well, as you might have heard, iGlobal recently took over Ocean's Airline, the company where I work, so some of us were invited here for a meeting with Mr. Harry, Anita explained. Although she had been hoping to meet the CEO, how could he have missed such a significant detail? Although he had already started bidding for Ocean's Airline before he met Anita, he couldn't remember her mentioning she worked there. That was probably because she had deliberately kept it away from him for reasons best known to her. I see, Tom said disinterestedly.